Thank you, John. In celebrity culture, we destroy what we worship. The commercial exploitation of Michael Jackson's death was orchestrated by the corporate forces that rendered Jackson insane. Jackson, robbed of his childhood and surrounded by vultures that preyed on his fears and weaknesses, was so consumed by self-loathing, he carved his African-American face into a Caucasian death mask. He hid his apparent pedophilia behind a Peter Pan illusion of eternal childhood. He could not disentangle his public and his private self. He became a commodity, a product, one to be sold, used, and manipulated. He was infected by the moral nihilism and personal disintegration that is at the core of our corporate culture. And his fantasies of eternal youth, delusions of majesty, and desperate, disfiguring quests for physical transformation were an expression of our own yearning. He was a reflection of us in the extreme. His memorial service, a variety show with a coffin, had an average of 31.1 million television viewers. It was the final episode in the long-running Michael Jackson series. And the stories that enthrall us are real-life stories: early fame, wild success, and then a long, bizarre, and macabre, emotional train wreck. O.J. Simpson offered a tamer version of the same plot. So does Tiger Woods and Britney Spears. Jackson, by the end, was heavily in debt and had weathered a $22 million out-of-court settlement to Jordy Chandler, as well as 7 counts of child sexual abuse and 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent in order to commit a felony. Jackson reflected our own physical and psychological disintegration, especially with many Americans struggling with overwhelming debt, loss of status, and deep personal confusion. The lurid drama of Jackson's personal life meshed perfectly with the ongoing dramas on television, in movies, and the news. News reports on television are mini-dramas. They come complete with a star, a villain, a supporting cast, a good-looking host, and a dramatic, if often unexpected, ending. In Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's novel about a future dystopia, people spend most of the day watching giant television screens that show endless scenes of police chases and criminal apprehensions. Life, Bradbury understood, once it was packaged, scripted, given a narrative, and filmed, became the most compelling form of entertainment. And Jackson was a great show. He deserved a great finale. Those who created Jackson's public persona and turned him into a piece of property, first as a child and finally as a corpse encased in a $15,000 golden casket, are the agents, publicists, marketing departments, plastic surgeons, script writers, advertisers, video technicians, and television personalities who orchestrate the vast stage of celebrity for profit. And yet, we measure our lives by these celebrities. We seek to be like them. We emulate their look and behavior. We escape the messiness of real life through the fantasy of their stardom. We too long to attract admiring audiences for our grand, ongoing life movie. We try to see ourselves moving through our life as a camera would see us, mindful of how we hold ourselves, how we dress, what we say. We invent movies that play inside our heads with us as stars. We wonder how an audience would react. Celebrity culture has taught us almost unconsciously to generate interior, personal screenplays, and we have learned ways of speaking and thinking that grossly disfigure the way we relate to the world and those around us. Neil Gabler, who has written wisely about this, argues that celebrity culture is not a convergence of consumer culture and religion, so much as a hostile takeover of religion by consumer culture. Celebrity culture licenses a dark voyeurism into other people's humiliation, pain, weakness, and betrayal. Education, building community, honesty, transparency, and sharing are qualities that will see you ridiculed and voted off any reality show. Fellow competitors for prize money and a chance for fleeting fame elect to disappear the unwanted. And celebrities that can no longer generate publicity, good or bad, vanish. Life, these shows teach, is a brutal world of unadulterated competition and a constant quest for notoriety and attention. And our self-exaltation permits the humiliation of those who oppose us. Those who lose deserve to be erased. Those who fail, those who are deemed ugly, ignorant, or poor are belittled and mocked. Human beings are used, betrayed, and discarded in a commodity culture, which is pretty much the story of Jackson's life. The cult of the self, which Jackson embodied, dominates our culture. This cult has within it the classic traits of psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity and self-importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying, deception, and manipulation, and the incapacity for remorse or guilt. Jackson, from his phony marriages to the portraits of himself dressed as royalty, to his insatiable hunger for new toys, to his questionable relationships with young boys, had all these qualities. And this is also the ethic promoted by corporations. It is the ethic of unfettered capitalism. It is the misguided belief that personal style and personal advancement, mistaken for individualism, are the same as democratic equality. It is the celebration of image over substance. We have a right in the cult of the self to get whatever we desire. We can do anything, even belittle and destroy those around us, including our friends, to make money, to be happy, and to become famous. Once fame and wealth are achieved, they become their own justification, their own morality, and how one gets there is irrelevant. And it is this perverted ethic that gave us Wall Street bankers and investment houses that willfully trashed the global economy, stole money from tens of millions of small shareholders who had bought stock in these corporations for retirement or college. And the heads of these corporations, like the winners on a reality television program who lied and manipulated others to succeed, walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses and compensation. The ethic of Wall Street is the ethic of celebrity. But the tantalizing illusions offered by our consumer culture are vanishing as we head towards collapse. The jobs we are shedding are not coming back, as Lawrence Summers tacitly acknowledges when he talks of a jobless recovery. The travails of the poor are rapidly becoming the travails of the middle class, especially as unemployment insurance runs out. and class warfare once buried under the happy illusion that we were all going to enter an age of prosperity with unfettered capitalism, is returning with a vengeance. In his book, Democracy Incorporated, Sheldon Wolin, who taught political philosophy at Berkeley and later at Princeton, uses the phrase inverted totalitarianism to describe our political system. Inverted totalitarianism, unlike classical totalitarianism, does not revolve around a demagogue or a charismatic leader. It finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. It purports to cherish democracy, patriotism, and the Constitution, while manipulating internal levers to subvert and thwart the democratic process. Political candidates are elected in popular votes by citizens, but are ruled by armies of corporate lobbyists. A corporate media controls nearly everything we read, watch, or hear, and imposes a bland uniformity of opinion. In classical totalitarian regimes, such as Nazi fascism or Soviet communism, economics was subordinate to politics. Under inverted totalitarianism, the reverse is true, Wolin writes. Economics dominates politics, and with that domination comes different forms of ruthlessness. The Obama brand offers us an image that appears radically individualistic and new. This image inoculates us from seeing that the old engines of corporate power and the vast military-industrial complex continue to plunder the country. Brand Obama is about being happy consumers. We are entertained, we feel hopeful, but like all branded products spun out from the manipulative world of corporate advertising, we are being duped into doing and supporting a lot of things that are not in our interest. A few weeks before Obama won the presidential elections, Obama beat Nike, Apple, Coors, and Zappos to win the Association of National Advertisers' top annual award, Marketer of the Year. What for all our faith and hope has the Obama brand given us? His administration has spent, lent, or guaranteed $12.8 trillion in taxpayer dollars to Wall Street and insolvent banks in a doomed effort to reinflate the bubble economy. Brand Obama has allocated nearly $1 trillion in defense-related spending and the continuation of our doomed imperial project in Iraq, where military planners estimate that between 50 to 70,000 troops will remain for the next 15 to 20 years. And Brand Obama has expanded the war in Afghanistan, including the use of drones sent on cross-border bombing runs into Pakistan that have left over 700 civilians dead since Obama took office. Brand Obama has refused to ease restrictions so workers can organize, and because of pressure from the for-profit healthcare industry, refuses to consider single-payer, not-for-profit healthcare for all Americans. And Brand Obama will not prosecute the Bush administration for war crimes, including the use of torture, and has refused to dismantle Bush's secrecy laws or restore habeas corpus. Corporations which control our politics no longer produce products that are different, but brands that are different. And Brand Obama does not threaten the core of the corporate state any more than did Brand George W. Bush. The decline of American empire began long before the current economic meltdown or the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It began before the first Gulf War or Ronald Reagan. It began when we shifted, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from an empire of production to an empire of consumption. By the end of the Vietnam War, when the costs of the war ate away at Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and domestic oil production began its steady, inexorable decline, we saw our country transformed from one that primarily produced to one that primarily consumed. We started borrowing to maintain a level of consumption as well as an empire we could no longer afford. We began to use force, especially in the Middle East, to feed our insatiable thirst for cheap oil. And the bill is now due. America's most dangerous enemies are not Islamic radicals, but those who sold us the perverted ideology of free market capitalism and globalization. They have dynamited the very foundations of our society. In the 17th century, these speculators would have been hung. Today they run the government and consume billions in taxpayer subsidies. It was Bill Clinton who led the Democratic Party to the corporate watering trough. Clinton argued that the party could ditch labor unions, no longer a source of votes or power, as a political ally. Workers, he insisted, would vote Democratic anyway. They had no choice. It was better, Clinton argued, to take corporate money and do corporate bidding. By the 1990s, the Democratic Party, under Clinton's leadership, had virtual fundraising parity with the Republicans, and today the Democrats get more. The legislation demanded by corporations, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, thrust a knife into the back of the American working class. NAFTA was peddled by the Clinton White House as an opportunity to raise incomes and prosperity of the citizens of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We were told it would staunch Mexican immigration. But NAFTA, which took effect in 1994, reversed every one of Clinton's predictions. Once the Mexican government lifted price supports on corn and beans grown by Mexican farmers, those farmers had to compete with the huge agribusinesses in the United States, and many were swiftly bankrupt. At least 2 million Mexican farmers have been driven off their land since 1994, and guess where many of them went? This desperate flight of poor Mexicans into the United States is now being exacerbated by large-scale factory closures along the border as manufacturers pack up and leave Mexico for China. NAFTA was great if you were a corporation. It was a disaster if you were a worker. And we are now getting a taste of Clinton's draconian welfare reform bill signed in 1996 as tens of millions of people face the prospect of losing their unemployment benefits and attempting to survive on the $143 a month you receive from welfare. It was the Clinton administration led by Summers which ripped down the firewalls that had been established by the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, designed to prevent the kind of meltdown we are now experiencing. Glass-Steagall established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It set in place banking reforms to stop speculators from hijacking the financial system. With Glass-Steagall demolished and the passage of NAFTA, the Democrats tumbled gleefully into bed with corporations and Wall Street speculators. And many of the architects of this deregulation, economists such as Summers, have come back to serve corporate interests in the Obama White House. The cost of our empire of illusion is not being paid for by corporate titans. It is being paid for on the streets of our inner cities, in former manufacturing towns, and in depressed rural enclaves. Human beings are not commodities. They are not goods. Their misery is not morally excusable because of the demands of the market. They grieve and suffer and feel despair. They lose their dignity with their jobs, their sense of self-worth. Human beings, not corporations, raise children and maintain communities. And the growing class divide is not understood by complicated sets of statistics or the utopian faith in unregulated globalization. It is understood in the eyes of a man or woman who is no longer making enough money to live with dignity and hope. The assault on the American working class, an assault that has devastated members of my own family in the former mill towns in the state of Maine, shows no sign of abatement. In the past 3 years, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. workers was laid off, and among workers laid off from full-time work, roughly 1/4 were earning $40,000 a year. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class, and the assault on the middle class is underway. Washington has become our Versailles. The media has evolved into a class of courtiers. The Democrats, like the Republicans, are courtiers. Our pundits, academic experts, and financial analysts, at least those with prominent public platforms, are courtiers. And we are captivated by the hollow stagecraft of political theater as we are ruthlessly stripped of power. Being a courtier requires agility and eloquence, and the most talented of them should be credited as persuasive actors. They entertain us. They make us feel good. They are the smiley faces of a corporate state. But when the corporations make their iron demands, these courtiers drop to their knees. They placate the telecommunications companies that want to be protected from lawsuits. They permit oil and gas companies to rake in obscene profits and keep in place vast subsidies of corporate welfare. They allow our for-profit driven healthcare system to leave the uninsured and underinsured to suffer and die. And over 40,000 Americans died last year because they could not get proper medical care. The for-profit healthcare industry, like the defense industry, makes money from death and suffering. It is legally permitted in this country to hold a sick child hostage while their families frantically bankrupt themselves to save their sons or daughters. Any discussion of health care should acknowledge the fact that our for-profit healthcare system is the problem and must be destroyed. Only then can we have an honest debate about what comes next. But this will never happen. It will never happen because the industry's money and lobbyists drive the discussion, as well as the shape of the so-called health care reform bill. America is devolving into a third world nation, and if we do not immediately halt our elites' rapacious looting of the public treasury and our bizarre state socialism for corporations, we will be left with trillions in debts which can never be repaid, and widespread human misery which we will be helpless to ameliorate. Tens of millions of people, brutally controlled, will live in perpetual poverty, a state of neo-feudalism. This is the inevitable result of unchecked corporate capitalism. In his book, The Great Transformation, written in 1944, Karl Polanyi laid out the devastating consequences, the depressions, wars, and inevitable totalitarianism that grow out of a so-called self-regulated free market. Polanyi grasped that fascism, like socialism, was rooted in a market society that refused to function. He warned that a financial system always devolved without heavy government control into a mafia capitalism and a mafia political system. A self-regulated market inevitably turns human beings, as well as the natural environment, into commodities, a situation that ensures the destruction of both society and the natural world. The free market's assumption that nature and human beings are objects whose worth is determined by the market allows each to be exploited for profit until exhaustion or collapse. A society that no longer recognizes that nature and human life have a sacred dimension, an intrinsic value beyond monetary value, commits collective suicide. Such societies cannibalize themselves until they die. We have been borrowing at a rate of more than $2 billion a day over the last 10 years, and at some point, it has to end. By 2010, because of the bailouts, stimulus packages, giveaways, and short-term debt, we will have to finance $5 trillion in debt. That is about $96 billion in debt auctioned off every week. If China and the oil-rich states do not buy this debt, the buyer of last resort will be the Federal Reserve. And this will have the effect of essentially printing endless amounts of money. Our currency, at this point, will become junk. A furious and sustained backlash, which we can already see leaping up around the fringes of American society, will be sustained by a betrayed and angry populace, one unprepared intellectually, emotionally, and psychologically for collapse. This populist revolt will sweep aside the Democrats and most of the Republicans. It was the economic collapse in Yugoslavia that gave us Slobodan Milosevic. It was the Weimar Republic that vomited up Adolf Hitler, and it was the breakdown in Tsarist Russia that opened the door for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. A cobble of proto-fascist misfits, from Christian demagogues to loudmouth talk show hosts who we naively dismiss as buffoons, will find a following with promises of revenge, moral renewal, and new glory. How will we cope with our decline? Will we cling to the absurd dreams of an imperial superpower and the fantasies of a glorious tomorrow? Or will we responsibly face our stark new limitations? Will we heed those who are sober and rational, those who speak of a new simplicity and humility in an age of imperial as well as material decline? Or will we follow the demagogues and charlatans who rise up in moments of crisis and panic? Will we radically transform our society to one that protects the ordinary citizen and fosters the common good, that defies the corporate state, that dismantles empire? Or will we employ the brutality and technology of our internal security and surveillance apparatus to crush dissent and drive us into a new dark age? Social and political reform never comes from accommodating the power structure. It comes from frightening it. The Liberty Party, which fought slavery, the suffragists who battled for women's rights, the labor movement and the civil rights movements knew that the question, as Karl Popper wrote, was not, how do we get good people to rule? Most of those attracted to power are at best mediocrities and often venal. But how do we limit the damage the powerful do to us? These mass movements were the real engines for social reform, the correctives to our democracy, and the true protectors of the rights of citizens. They never achieved formal political power, but they are a reminder that, as Studs Terkel used to say, hope has never trickled down. It has always sprung up. We must opt out of the mainstream. We must articulate and stand firmly and unequivocally, even if this turns us at first into outcasts on the side of working men and women. We must no longer be content with the crumbs tossed to us by the power elite in the vain hope that accommodation will work. We must become as militant as those who are seeking our enslavement. If we remain passive, we will soon be engulfed by a ruthless totalitarian capitalism. If we remain passive, as we undergo the largest transference of wealth upwards in American history, we will become serfs. If we fight back, we have a chance. The saturation coverage of Jackson's death was yet another example of our collective flight into illusion. It deflected the moral questions arising from mounting injustice, growing inequalities, costly imperial wars, economic collapse, and political corruption. As we sink into an economic and political morass, as we barrel towards a crisis that will create more misery than the Great Depression, we remain controlled, manipulated, and distracted by the celluloid shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. The fantasy of celebrity culture is not designed simply to entertain. It is designed to drain us emotionally, confuse us about our identity, blame ourselves for our predicament, condition us to chase illusions of unachievable fame and happiness, and keep us from fighting back. And in the end, that is all the Jackson coverage was really about. Another tawdry and tasteless spectacle to divert a dying culture from the baying wolf at the gate. Thank you.
Chris, I suspect that in the 17th century that you alluded to, the end of a classic American Jeremiad, it was sometimes hard for the congregants to know where the preacher was suggesting that hope might be placed. Not in princes, not in delusions, not in the industry of happiness psychology that you so trenchantly analyze in your book. I think they probably had to listen between the lines and to the end, the way I did when I read your book. I found one of the most poignant moments actually in the endnotes, where you express your gratitude to your one-time teacher and mentor at Colgate, Coleman Brown, the Reverend Coleman Brown. And you say that he always directed you beyond your own despair to look deeply enough to see in humankind the potential, the hope for some further good. Tell us a little more about where to look.
I think the failure of the American left is due to two crucial mistakes. The first is that it's not our job to achieve formal political power. It's our job to stand fast with a moral imperative in the way that all the great reformers in society did. And most of them began as very isolated, marginal, and often ridiculed figures. And I think the second mistake is to succumb to a kind of practicality whereby we judge the efforts that we make in the fight for justice by what we see around us. And this is the strength of the religious left. Figures like Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, is that we have to, I think, finally find within us the strength or the faith to believe that what we are doing, while it may not transform society or the world in our lifetime, nevertheless has a kind of a power that often we don't recognize in the moment. I spent almost 2 decades as a war correspondent, and I watched figures stand up in El Salvador, Oscar Romero being one, or in the Balkans, and the ability even for a sole individual to express another way of being, to nurture a community. In the wars in Yugoslavia, when they began, the first people killed were not the opposing warlord or leader of the other ethnic group, but that within your own community who still had Muslim friends or Croat friends or Serb friends, who defied that narrative of hate. And the situation that we face is very bleak. We lack the tools to disrupt the rape of the nation by the corporate state. Labor unions are a spent force. Our political system has become, I think, as Sheldon Woolen correctly points out, a system of inverted totalitarianism. Our press, certainly our responsible print press, is dying. Resistance in many ways will be local. And I think that we'll have to find sustenance in a belief that no matter how bleak it gets, that act of resistance, that ability to retain our integrity, is in and of itself a victory. During the war in the Balkans, where there were horrific acts of genocide, I and other journalists, at some risk, would walk into towns where the Serbs had carried out massacres, whether in Kosovo or whether in Bosnia. They would cut the roads. We would have to go in the back way with our satellite phones, report on what had happened, and file those stories. Certainly, it didn't stop them from carrying out a massacre the next day, but each act like that, each act that broke from the abstract sort of despair that comes with viewing the genocide at large, was one that I think empowered us to go from one day to a next. And no act of resistance is futile. It's when you give in to cynicism or when you give in to despair that you die. You die morally, you die spiritually. I think the great writers of spiritualism are not those sort of self-help gurus and the narcissism of how is it with us, but people like King or Bonhoeffer, who knew that true spirituality came with that eternal battle for justice.
Thank you, Chris. The ability to retain our own integrity is in and of itself a victory. I'm reminded of being introduced to a website called Americans Who Tell the Truth, put up by a Maine artist who, in the mendacity leading up to the Iraq War, looked around for people doing precisely that.
Mr. Hedges, I thank you so much for telling the truth about so much of the evil and sickness of the current American society. I agree with everything you said except one word. Talking at some point about American policy and budget, you used the word defense. Granted that we've called our military budget defense budget, that's a lie. We have a military budget. President Dwight David Eisenhower, as he left office, warned us of the military-industrial complex. You also did not mention that more than 6 decades after the end of World War II, more than 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, your government and mine and all of our government, the federal government, which takes most of our resources and spends them, is spending over 1/2 of our budget every year on imperialism, and you did mention the word empire a number of times. When are we, the American people, and how can you help us, going to cut that military budget?
Sustainable. I mean, the fact is we're borrowing to maintain empire, just as we are borrowing to maintain a level of consumption. I mean, real wages in this country have dropped for 90% of Americans since the early 1970s. So either we confront reality. I mean, the thing about a dream is that, as King understood, a dream is something you strive towards. An illusion is something you live within. And illusions are very dangerous. You see it, these illusions fed to the American consumer across the political and spectrum. I mean, whether it's Oprah or the Christian right or corporatism or Hollywood, it's that false belief that if we just dig deep enough within ourselves, if we focus on happiness, if we grasp that we are truly exceptional, we can have everything that we want. And that has that kind of, it has fostered a kind of infantilism, a state of perpetual childishness, and that's very dangerous, because as the gap opens up between the illusion and the reality that is confronting us, confronting tens of millions of people in this country whose homes are being foreclosed, who are going bankrupt because they can't pay their medical bills, who are finally beginning to realize that the jobs they've lost are not coming back, and that not only is there not hope for them, but there is not hope for their children, then they react as children. And they search for a savior, somebody who will come in and save them. Whether it's the environmental crisis, whether it's the permanent war economy, whether it's the destruction of our manufacturing base, these illusions run all the way across the cultural spectrum, and I think replicate, if you look at dying empires, whether it's the Austro-Hungarian or the Roman, replicate those twilight periods when people become utterly unmoored from a reality-based universe.
With both the current vice president and president starting to speak very well of the surge and using the word and supporting it, does that ultimately give more, does it rewrite the history, and especially over time, that this was effective, this was a good use of the military, and that the kind of criticism we have isn't as valid over time? Right. And how does that affect the budget, and how does that affect...
You're talking about the Iraqi surge?
The Iraqi surge, correct.
One of the most horrifying things for me about the Bush administration, or about the Obama administration, is that what it has done is codify the egregious assault on civil liberties and the destruction of the rule of law that was put in place by the Bush administration, not only domestically but internationally. Preemptive war under post-Nuremberg laws is defined as a criminal war of aggression. It's illegal. We have no right as a nation to debate the terms of the occupation. As someone who has covered these kinds of conflicts, it's utterly unsustainable over the long term. These are long wars of attrition, and you know, I used to go into the airport in Algiers, and it would say, "Welcome to Algeria, land of a million martyrs." And Iraqis and Afghanis will bleed in a way that we won't, to expel foreign occupiers from their country. So yes, you know, without getting into the tactics of the surge and the buying off of the Sunni militias, and yeah, they have. You're very correct in pointing out that they have embraced not only the policies but the rhetoric. But of course, you know, they've kept the same Secretary of Defense. I mean,
embracing that makes the defense system stronger in the long run. But in that case,
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
The next questioner.
Hi. I find the need to point out one thing. If we were a conservative group, you use the word elite, which I find amusing. You would be the elite because you read, but enough of that. I had a specific question about how do you address young people? How do you get parents to address young people with the toys, I mean, I think it starts so young, you know, when I'm seeing a 10-year-old with a BlackBerry at Disneyland where her father has spent $500 to bring the entire family for the day, and she's doing this, and it starts so young, and everybody has to have a 50-inch television set and surround sound, and, you know, if we can't pull people away from the toys, how do we get them
well, you raise
to
an extreme,
read the history so
yeah,
we don't
you
do
raise
it
a very
again?
important point, that people retreat into virtual ghettos.
Yeah.
And the danger of these virtual ghettos is that they sever you from your community. Television did it pretty effectively, but we've become, you know, even more sophisticated in cutting people off from everyone around them. And I'll, you know, refer you to a book who you know, this book, You Are Not a Gadget, by Lanier, who writes about, and I think correctly, about how dangerous the internet can become for all of the reasons that you point out, that essentially you retreat into these anonymous crowds and with anonymity. And so when you read the kinds of comments that are put up, even on liberal blogs, they're absolutely hate-filled. I mean, every time I write an article, you know, I graduated from Harvard Divinity School, which has probably, without doubt, produced more atheists than any other divinity school in the country.
There are plenty of gods
and
not believing in.
And when the London Review of Books interviewed my book on atheism, they called me a non-believer. But every time I write something, there's, you know, one of the acceptable bigotries on the left is to attack people who find value and worth in religious thought. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, it's why I don't own a television.
Yeah. And one of the values in actually having citizens, human beings, come together on evenings like this, speak directly to one another, ask questions, dialogue with someone who has applied a great deal of literate thought to the issues of the time, rather than simply throwing up images. Next question.
Mr. Hedges, I just thought it might be relevant. I need to give you a little CD on myself. I'm a decorated veteran of Vietnam and a member of Veterans for Peace. And you're one of the authors on my very short list that I read all the time, and yours is the most brilliant description of what's going on today that I find out there. We in the left, and I'm a recovering ultra-leftist, who was very active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, described the problem very well. But right now, my assessment is that the left is paralyzed and completely out of it. And so I've been toying with the idea of, and I know you have written a book about the American right. Why is it not, because, and I've read some of the stuff that they've been writing, and I read Joe Stack's manifesto, which could have been written by a leftist, by the way.
Yeah, I read it.
There was an article in Mother Jones this month about the Oath Keepers.
Right.
And they actually have taken an oath not to carry out martial law orders.
Right.
What do you think about the possibility of the left and the right trying to come to some mutual understandings in a united front effort?
Well, you raise a very good point. I think the American left is bankrupt, both in terms of its institutions and its moral core. We should have walked out on the Democratic Party in 1994 with NAFTA, and we didn't. We continued to speak in a language by which we ostensibly defended the rights of working men and women while we supported a party that utterly destroyed the working class in this country. Again, I think that our failure was based on the idea that it wasn't practical. It's, you know, that fighting that least worst candidate. But what it's done since the Reagan administration, if not before, is make us appear absolutely hollow. We speak in the bloodless language of issues and policy, and we have allowed the right to express and articulate a very legitimate rage, which is rising up within our society. And I think we have to be willing to stand alone. We have to be willing to risk a certain amount of ridicule for stepping outside the mainstream. Because if we don't, that bankruptcy of liberalism will empower, further empower these proto-fascist movements that I think are extremely dangerous and can snuff out what's left of our very anemic democracy. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is the perfect example of the defeated dreamer, the mouse man, the person who had high ideals and voted for Obama, and he didn't deliver, so now he doesn't want to do anything anymore. That's just what the right wants. I voted for Nader the last election, and I voted for Nader for many reasons. One of the big ones being that I spent so much of my life in war that I will not, and I have so many friends in the Middle East who have suffered egregiously, without being melodramatic, some of whom have died, and I have to go back there and tell them that I did everything, no matter how futile it was, to stand up against this war machine, and hopefully have earned the right to ask for their forgiveness. I think we've lost our moral core, and we have to refine that moral core. And when people take moral stances in society, it's painful, it's lonely, it's difficult. Read, the biography of King. Alone when he began and alone when he finished. Defections even within his own movement because he wouldn't embrace black power. Got up a month or two before he died and said, I take nonviolence to be my lawfully wedded wife, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. And these are our leaders. These are Martin Luther King, was our greatest president, most powerful man in the 1960s. Garrow's biography, Bearing the Cross, he carried that cross until, of course, he finally knew and of course Hoover and Johnson, after he denounced the war, withdrew the FBI protection. He knew he would be killed. And I think if we don't recover that moral core, we have no weapon with which to fight back. And we are going to be engulfed by terrifying movement like Oath Keepers, who have, as you point out, a correct analysis of the problem, understand the rape that is being carried out by corporate entities, but what they propose is terrifying. And we have nothing yet on the left to stand up and counter it with.
It was the night that Dr. King was killed, Chris, that I came into this church, this very church, recognizing that there was a need to keep alive the prophetic questions. And to keep alive those questions, you need communities that agree to live in the spirit of the questions, even without having all of the answers. Our next question.
I'm David Fellingham. I'm also a member of the Smedley D. Butler Brigade of Veterans for Peace here in Cambridge. And not to belabor, the issues, but I'm concerned about unmasking neoliberalism, especially Clinton with his new plan for Haiti. Could you talk a little bit about the lure of neoliberalism and how, as a movement, we can deal with it?
It's become what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference, and if you turn on any television show, that's all it is. The fundamental, the engine of the permanent war economy, of American imperialism, of the Wall Street theft of taxpayer funds and rise of a criminal class of speculators remains unquestioned by either the left or the right. And as the working class in this country, the working class, it's sort of a misnomer. There are 40 million Americans who live in real poverty. The disenfranchisement of the working class, the rage that it feels, I think, and the anger that it feels towards these courtiers in political power and courtiers in the media is is one that is driven by the utter disconnect from what they hear and what they're experiencing. So, yeah, I mean, neoliberalism essentially is bought into the utopian fiction of unfettered markets and globalization, and so that there really is just a bland uniformity of opinion that's imposed by powerfully driven corporate media entities, and real debate. I mean, healthcare being the perfect example. Real, honest debate never seeps into the national discourse. So I think the failure on the part of those of us who care about the working class, who care about social reform, who care about an egalitarian society, is to have signed on to this neoliberal project. And Clinton, I think, is the poster child for it. I hate Bill Clinton because I was in Bosnia when Bill Clinton was president. I got a taste of, I saw the corpses caused by his cowardice. And he knew better because at the dedication of the Holocaust Museum, Elie Wiesel got up and spoke about Bosnia because Wiesel understood the lesson of the Holocaust, which is when you have the capacity to stop genocide and you do not, you are culpable.
We're listening to the Cambridge Forum with Chris Hedges, the author of his latest book, Empire of Illusion. We are in dialogue between Mr. Hedges and members of the audience gathered here at the First Parish in Cambridge.
Thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to ask for some of your insight that you could possibly connect to one of three things. Either A, people who believe they are above the national system, the Davos man, or B, the efforts in an empire that has slipped away, Great Britain, for example, Gordon Brown and what he's trying to do, or C, people who really well and truly are outside the system, the Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, who are trying to bring back the idea of a sustainable society. Is there anything in any of those areas I mentioned that you would offer as something where we could draw a lesson or potentially some hope? I
think all resistance, to the extent that we can begin to resist, will be local. Food is going to be huge. Our food system is not sustainable. I live in New Jersey. My tomatoes come from California. It's absurd. What happens? Fossil fuel is a terminal resource. These food deserts. I just did a story out of Camden, New Jersey, which will be out in the May issue of Harper's Magazine, which is the per capita the poorest city in the country. There is no supermarket in Camden. There's no hotel. There's no movie theater. And these apocalyptic centers of post-industrial America and the problems that they engender are going to begin to seep outwards across the American land, already are beginning to. I mean, I did a book on the Christian right and was all over the country for it, and there are whole sections of America where, for many people, the end of the world is no longer an abstraction. And the only way to break this proto-fascist movement is not by arguing with them, because these people have slipped into a non-reality-based belief system. It is by re-enfranchising them economically into the system. And if that is not done, we're finished.
Thanks. There's another word. The word surge is an interesting word. It struck me that word was deployed by the Bush administration precisely at the moment when the storm surge across the Gulf Coast had splintered whatever might have been left of the Bush administration's credibility, and all of a sudden there was this other surge that was going to be deemed a success. I would like to add, King, I think it may have been the title of his last collection or published work was Chaos or Community. And I would like to ask you to push a little further into the realm of community as an important piece of what you're talking about, the absence of community, the fracturing of community, the disintegration of community, and community as the basis potentially for resistance and whatever effective political action you might think might be possible? And what are the, because I think there are tremendous obstacles to community, and without that, it's hard to imagine how we might, other than in, sort of the retreat into private decency, as Bill Kunstler once called it, hiding in little groups and surviving.
Well, community is key, because a long-term act of resistance is not sustainable without community. The tragedy is that so many of the institutions, and I would, put the liberal church high on the list, have failed us. They, in the name of tolerance, have not denounced these Christian radicals who are heretics. They're not Christians. They have acculturated the worst of American capitalism and the worst of American imperialism into the Christian religion. And where has the church been? Silent. Where has the academy been? What is the head of a university, a president of a university is installed for what? To raise money. The deputy of the deputy on the Harvard Board of Overseers is the deputy chair is Robert Rubin. The corporation, I mean, yeah. We've utterly lost, the capacity within institutional structures to sustain or foment a community that promotes justice, both within the academy and within the church. The press, the serious press, is dying, the print press. We're making that transformation from a society, from a print-based society, and I worked in a newspaper for a long time. I'm not here to defend commercial media. I understand the lies that they tell, but they're the lies of omission. It's what they don't tell you. Chomsky got that right. But what they did tell you was based on verifiable fact. It was reported, researched, and checked. But with the destruction of print, then you have a national discourse or national dialogue that is no longer based on verifiable fact. Facts and opinion are interchangeable. Lies are true. Death panels are real. So I think we have to turn and look local, and I think you're right. We can't do it alone. We'll be destroyed if we try and do it alone. We have to try and build units of like-minded people, and we have to, don't build it as, I think it was Dewey who understood, no, it was Irving Howe, don't do it around movements, do it around campaigns. Food, for instance, is a good example. To the extent that we can divorce ourselves from the consumer economy and the corporate state, every step that we take to do that is a small victory.
You're listening to the Cambridge Forum. We're in dialogue with Chris Hedges, author of Empire of Illusion.
Hi, Chris. I knew you a long time ago, if you remember. I have a comment, and I'm going to ask you a question out of it. There was a woman, a religious sister that I think you knew, Sister Maria Gastanil, who wrote a book called The Socio-Theology of Letting Go, which meant that, in which she stated, when the poor reach out to take what is rightfully theirs, the rich should let go. And in the many years since she wrote that, and in the many years that I've been working, that's been the premise on which I basically have functioned and have done the resistance. Because in most of my time, in the peace movement and the justice movement, it has been that. It has been finding people with which you can resist the structures that we have. And the structure question is always the question that's not mentioned anywhere today. And Marie used to talk about, we are all part of one system today. There aren't many systems. It's one world. And my thinking, what you wrote has brought together a lot of the thinking and the writing that I've done. And in the recent weeks and months, I've been thinking, looking at what's happening in this country, looking at the politics, the economics of it, I've come to the conclusion that this is going to sound terrible to people, but I'm not going to apologize for it. It's where I'm coming from at this point, looking at what I'm seeing. That maybe it's not a bad thing for the rest of the world that the United States and its people go into decline and become like a third world country, which we do have pockets of. There is a movement among the people of the world, as I'm sure you know, where they are not affected by the media in the same way we are. You know, some people still don't have televisions and stuff like that. And they are talking about another world being possible, another world being necessary. The theologians among them also talk about another God being necessary. Why would it not be a good thing what's happening in this country now for them?
You raise a very good point. I had dinner with Daniel Berrigan a few months ago, who said the tragedy is not that the American empire is declining, the tragedy is that we're bringing so many people down with us. I don't think that learning to live with a new simplicity or learning to speak to the rest of the world with a new humility instead of in the language of violence is going to impoverish us spiritually. It will impoverish us materially, but not spiritually. And what I fear is that we have the possibility of a deformed oligarchic system which creates a neo-feudalistic state whereby at least 2/3 of Americans are kept through draconian control in a state of perpetual poverty. And that's what, I mean, these corporations are not going to go away unless they're made to go away. ExxonMobil is not going to allow energy independence. It would devastate their profits. Halliburton, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, tens of billions of dollars they take from taxpayers in weapons contracts. They're not going to ever give this up on their own. And but I think that the destruction of consumer culture and the destruction of American empire is not, in moral terms, a negative for us, and perhaps can allow us to recover some of our own humanity.
You just mentioned the word violence, and you had certainly alluded earlier to violent revolution in 1789 and 1917. I wish you would talk a little bit more about violence. There's a lot of violence in America already. There's individual violence, and there's violence that is pushed by the very system that you're decrying. There's also a lot of official violence, and there's violence that's disguised and violence that's not talked about. The violence of the right-wing white terrorist who's, you know, if he's not Muslim, we don't hear about him. So I wonder if you could talk about the ambiguity of violence and the difficulty of negotiating violence. How do you remain nonviolent and resist in a violent culture?
I'm not finally a pacifist for this reason. I lived in Sarajevo when it was being hit with 2,000 shells a day by Serbs who ringed the city. Constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. We were literally protected by a trench system. We knew from the Drina Valley, Vukovar, other areas that the Bosnian Serbs had overrun, that should the city be captured, about 1/3 of the residents would be slaughtered and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. But once people are pushed to violence, they embrace a poison. Violence is always tragic. I don't believe in just war theory. Those who orchestrated the defenses of Sarajevo at the beginning came from the criminal class. They were people who had a penchant for violence and an access to weapons. So I understand that when you're faced with the real possibility of your own annihilation, as those who lived in Sarajevo did face for 3.5 years, that recourse to violence is a normal human reaction. However, I also understand that once you reach that point, you are contaminated by violence. And that's the tragedy. We should build systems by which populations or groups of people don't have to resort to violence, because once that happens, it is a vast enterprise of necrophilia. War, and I've been in many, the essence of war is death. It is about the destruction of all systems of life, familial, ecological, social, political. And that's one of the things that terrifies me about what we're doing. Because there is no check on the corporate state. They will push and push and push until the dispossessed begin to carry out, they're already beginning to carry out acts of violence. And I understand it, but I also know that once that happens, then the moral order is always turned upside down.
I'm reminded of Reinhold Niebuhr, of whom our president claims to be an interpreter, writing in the middle of World War II in The Irony of American History, that once America took up arms against totalitarianism, against the Nazis, against genocide, its great danger would be to fall into the illusion of its own righteousness. And that, it seems to me, has played itself out over the last 50, 60 years in ways that the bulk of the American people have not been able to see through.
And now we're paying for it.
Yes. One last question this evening before we conclude our dialogue with Chris Hedges, the author of Empire of Illusion.
I'd like to say this in respect. I'm a recovering Irish Catholic and a long-term veteran for peace. I was a naval officer for 25 years. I've just got done radiation, and I've gone a little bit into solitude, and I read most of your stuff. As I said, I came from South Boston, and there was an inherent thing that we had in our soul, and it relates to what the Pharisees said. I said, when they talked about Christ, I said, what good comes from Nazareth? Forgive me if I somewhat, in my cynicism, wonder what good comes from Harvard. None that I know of. But I noticed that everybody here would agree that single payer is the answer. At all of these meetings, and I don't know much about peace, I know about war, but I never hear a vigorous or forceful thing to the antidote for the in military industrial complex. Why don't we pay taxes? I never hear that embraced by any speaker very much. And I believe that with respect to violence, you know, your vivid portrayal of our society was summed up in the 30s by Bill Wilson, who said, you know, it's self-will run riot. I thought it was brilliant to show Jackson, the person, and the society as a whole. But I do believe that this violence has to come, we must do violence for ourselves. I think there's where a legitimate violence, I don't know how to do that. But I do have a question in that I've been betrayed by everyone, just no less than Jesus Christ. You know, he's up there, he says, this shit is not working. What keeps you, with all your knowledge, I've begun to have some empathy for politicians, with what they know. What keeps you and I sometimes wrestle with, from blowing your brains out?
Anger. Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to make sure they don't remain the way they are. I think my father was a minister. He was driven from one church to the next because of his support of the civil rights movement. I grew up in an all-white rural enclave where Martin Luther King was probably one of the most hated men in America. He had been in North Africa. He was an army sergeant in World War II, and told me when I was about 12 that if the war was still being fought and I was drafted, he would go to prison with me. And I still have this image of sitting in a jail cell with my dad. And finally, he was a vocal supporter of the gay rights movement in the 1970s. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village. And my father had a particular understanding of the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that when I was at college at Colgate, he had a church in Syracuse, and when he found that there was no gay and lesbian organization, he brought the gay speakers to my campus, and I would have to join my dad and gay activists and groups of students. I was certainly one of the most committed heterosexuals at Colgate, talking about respect and dignity and other ways of being and believing. And this, after several of these meetings, led to students confiding in my father that they were too uncomfortable to publicly form a gay and lesbian alliance at Colgate, a problem he solved by arriving one day and taking me to lunch and telling me that I had to found it. So I founded the Gay and Lesbian Alliance at, I never attended, but I had my name on it every week. And when I would go into the dining hall for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, the checker would take my card, check it off, and hand it back and go, "Faggot." So I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend. Many years later, 20 years later, I had been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, months of my life in Iraq. I knew the folly of the invasion. I gave a commencement address in Rockford College in 2003, 2 weeks after George Bush landed on the aircraft carrier, and was booed off the stage. You can watch it on YouTube tonight. And there was heavy, the right-wing media picked it up and trashed me day in and day out, so that finally I was called in to the office of the New York Times and given a formal written reprimand and told that I must no longer speak about the war in Iraq. And as I sat in that office, you asked what gives me hope. As I sat in that office, I realized that I had a choice. I could pay fealty to my career and muzzle myself, but to do so would be to betray my dad. And I couldn't do that, and I quit. And when I walked out the door, I realized that what my father had given me was freedom. Thank you.